Hello, my name is Otis Watkins. I am the Assistant Principal of Student Services at Crete High School. I will be reviewing the 504 Rehabilitation Act of 1973 in this PowerPoint presentation. Without further ado, let's get started. What is Section 504? Section 504 is a brief but powerful non-discrimination law included in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504 extends to individuals with disabilities the same kinds of protections Congress extended to people discriminated against because of race and sex. No otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall solely by reason of his or her disability be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Congressman Vanek from Ohio and Senator Humphrey from Minnesota proposed this amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Every department within the executive branch of the federal government has regulations implementing the law. Because virtually every school district in the country accepts federal funds, public education is directly affected. A civil rights mandate, Section 504, prohibits discrimination. The responsibility not to discriminate applies to all school personnel. Special educators do not have primary responsibility for Section 504. Primary responsibility falls on districts and school level administrative leaders and regular education. You may pose the question, who is protected by Section 504? Any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Any physiological disorder or condition, cosmetic disfigurement, or anatomical loss affecting one or more body systems. Examples of physical impairments: epilepsy, AIDS and HIV, allergies, arthritis, heart disease, Tourette syndrome, cerebral palsy, visual impairment, broken limbs, cancer, diabetes, hemophilia, temporary conditions due to accidents or illness. Any mental or psychological disorder such as mental retardation, organic brain disorder, emotional or mental illness, and specific learning disability. Examples of mental impairments: ADD slash ADHD, reading disability, depression, eating disorders, conduct disorders, past drug alcohol addiction, and social maladjustment. Substantial limitation of a major life activity: breathing, walking, talking, seeing, hearing, learning, taking care of oneself. Otherwise qualified, applied to public education. Otherwise qualified means of public school age, when competitive criteria are applied. Otherwise qualified means that the criteria are met in spite of the disability. In employment, the person should be qualified in spite of his or her disability. Who is protected by Section 504? All public school students. Major principles of Section 504: protection from discrimination, that public schools do not discriminate against individuals with disabilities. This includes students, parents, teachers, and school staff. Discrimination refers to unequal treatment of qualified persons solely on the basis of their disability. The law protects students with disabilities from lack of equal opportunities to benefit from educational programs and facilities. Example of violations: by failing to provide physical access to programs or facilities, by imposing double standards for eligibility for extracurricular activities, by failing to design regular classroom programs to meet a disabled student's individual needs as adequately as the needs of a non-disabled student are met. Program accessibility: all educational programs must be accessible to those who need them. Not every room or program in a school building must be accessible to all students if the building or program as a whole is accessible. Other examples of violations are as follows: denying a student with a disability the use of educational programs or facilities because they are physically inaccessible to the student. Denying a student with physical disabilities the opportunity to take a class because it is not accessible to him or her. Denying parents with hearing impairments the opportunity to participate in PTA because the school does not provide an interpreter. Comparable facilities: if a school operates a separate facility for students with disabilities, this facility must be comparable to the district's other facilities. Comparable in terms of space, location, instructional appropriateness, accessibility, size, lighting, ventilation, temperature, etc. Further examples of violations include establishing classes for students with disabilities in areas that are not conducive to learning, storage rooms, partitioned areas, inadequate classrooms, small, no heat, and facilities in the classroom, no bathrooms. Students with disabilities can share in sacrifices made by all students, but cannot be singled out for more than their share of such sacrifices. Free appropriate public education: each student is disabled under the Section 504 must be provided with regular or special education and related aids and services designed to meet his or her individual educational needs as adequately as the needs of the non-disabled students are met. Evaluation: any student believed to need services because of Section 504 disability must be evaluated before initial placement. Individualized education: students served under Section 504 must have an individualized accommodation plan that details the services provided. Least restrictive environment: students with disabilities must be educated with students who are not disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. Due process procedures provides that the LEA must provide an impartial hearing for a parent who disagrees with the identification, evaluation, programming, or placement. An IEP meets the requirements of Section 504, but it is not advisable to develop IEPs for non-IDEA students. Creates confusion and too specific. Section 504 plans or individualized accommodation plans. Reasonable accommodations issued must provide a free, appropriate public education and be individualized. Section 504 does not detail the components of a individualized accommodation plan. It should be a written document. Most 504 students receive their education in the regular classroom, so the content does not have to be as extensive as an IEP. Modifications, related aids, and services. Failing to provide adequate staff training, equipment, and facilities for 504 students. Failing to educate the students in the least restrictive environment. Failing to provide related services because the needed services were unavailable and the district believed the services were too expensive. Failing to carry out agreed recommendations to address the behavior of a student. Failing to carry out provisions of a student's IEP. Failing to carry out provisions of an IEP because the paraprofessional who was to implement the plan was frequently absent. Failing to provide students with disabilities with properly trained teachers. Failing to give a student with disabilities the services listed in his or her 504 plan. Failing to provide the full amount of services called for in the IEP or 504 plan. Shortening the school day without considering the needs of a student. In closing, I have listed a few key points and reminders from this presentation. Special educators do not have primary responsibility for Section 504. Primary responsibility falls on district and school level administrative leaders in regular education. Again, who is protected by Section 504? Any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Who is specifically protected by Section 504? All public school students. This concludes my presentation, and I certainly hope this information will be of assistance. Thank you and continued success.